Eyewitnesses of Jesus, number 3. I didn't know it at the time, but this lesson will overlap very nicely with this morning's class. And so, but I want to get into a little bit of the external evidence as it combines with some internal evidence in the Gospels. And this morning, particularly the Gospel of Mark. Next Lord's Day evening, we'll look at Matthew, Luke, and John in a little bit more detail, but I really want to zero in on Mark this morning. One of the Christians outside the New Testament whose name that you should learn. You could add it to your repertoire after today and maybe do a little reading online perhaps. But Papias, who was an overseer in Hierapolis. As far as Hierapolis goes, we read of it in Colossians 4 and verse 13, along with Colossae and Laodicea. Those were 3 cities in the Lycus Valley in modern Turkey, and they were triplets. I just call them twin cities, but they were a triplet with each other and side by side. And Papias lived probably from about AD 60 to about AD 130. So he lived in the 1st century, and he would have overlapped with some of the eyewitnesses in his earlier years. He would have overlapped with some Christians who had seen Jesus in his earlier years. In fact, Irenaeus, who in his earlier days had Polycarp as a teacher, who in turn was an acquaintance and pupil of the Apostle John, says in around AD 170 that both Polycarp and his contemporary Papias were both hearers of John in their younger days. So at the end of the 1st century, Polycarp and Papias knew the Apostle John. And so he not only knew John, but he knew Philip's daughters, at least 2 of them, and several other eyewitnesses, as well as Christians, one link away from the eyewitnesses and or Jesus himself. And so he had contact with eyewitnesses several times, especially earlier in his life. And this is one of the things that he says, and very interesting. It says, along with the interpretations, I shall not hesitate to add all that I ever learned and carefully remembered from the elders, for I am sure of its truth. Unlike most, I did not delight in those who say much, but in those who teach the truth. Not in those who recite the commandments of others, but in those who repeated the commandments given by the Lord. And whenever anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I asked about their words, what Andrew or Peter had said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any of the other Lord's disciples, and what Aristion and the elder John, disciples of the Lord, were still saying. For I did not think that information with books would help me as much as the word of a living, surviving voice. It was very important to Papias to touch base with eyewitnesses of Jesus and or those who knew the eyewitnesses of Jesus, one link away whenever they would pass through Hierapolis or whenever he would have an opportunity to intersect with him. There were those even from ancient times who looked at this statement and thought that he was mentioning 2 Johns, one who was an elder or the Apostle John, and one of the elders mentioned at the top, and then at the bottom, another John who was the elder John. But in both cases, he calls John both among the elders and disciples, and in the latter case with Aristion, he is the elder John, and both are disciples. So in both instances, he is a disciple and an elder. And Everyone saying this? Well,
Yes. Thank you.
so I believe he's just mentioning John in two different connections. The same John, who happened to be an elder statesman in the church as an apostle of the Lord. The contrast is what John, along with these others, Andrew, Peter, Philip, Thomas, etc., had said at some point in the past, versus what Aristian and John were still saying, because John outlived all of these others. And so, and it's interesting too, that if you'll note 2 John verse 1 and 3 John verse 1, does anybody remember what John calls himself? The elder. Now, I don't know anyone else in the church who, I certainly wouldn't call myself that. The elder. But John could. It outlived all the other elder statesmen of early Christianity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next Sunday evening. But it gets really interesting when he not only shows his mode of operation, but starts talking about two of the Gospels in more specific detail. One of them is Mark. He says in Mark's Gospel, the elder, presumably John, used to say this also. Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote down accurately, but not in order, of all that he remembered of the things said and done by the Lord, for he had not heard the Lord or been one of his followers, but later, as I said, a follower of Peter. Peter used to teach as the occasion demanding without giving systematic arrangement to the Lord's sayings, so that Mark did not err in writing down some things just as he recalled them, for he had some overriding or one overriding purpose, to omit nothing that he had heard and to make no false statements in other words, an accurate representation, putting it all together of what Peter remembered by way of sermon points of what Jesus had said and done in Peter's various sermons and preaching on that. And so Mark took that and then wrote it down and compiled it into one gospel. As far as Matthew's contribution is concerned, he says that Matthew compiled the sayings of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each interpreted it the best that he could. Hebrew probably meaning Jewish Aramaic here. And as we looked at last week, the probable scenario, I think it's plausible scenario, I think it's probable, is that with the help of the Holy Spirit, the apostles compiled their collective and individual memories. In other words, you'd have only three of the apostles that were on the Mount of Transfiguration, and those same three that were in the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus. And so they would tell the others after the resurrection, this is what happened. And everybody would put their collective memories together. John 14, verse 26, the Holy Spirit, Spirit of truth, when he comes, he will guide you into all the truth, and he will cause you to remember all that I have said to you, Jesus says in John 14, verse 26. So then they put all of these individual episodes, remembered, collective memories, individual memories, into easily remembered, digestible, compact narrative units. And these vignettes were standalone, but fixed, standardized fairly much for handy for preaching, so that when you read, for instance, in Matthew's account or Mark's account of the woman that anoints Jesus on the night of his betrayal, that reads almost the exact same in Matthew and in Mark, because that was the standardized form in which that was preached. In fact, Jesus says in both accounts, wherever this gospel goes, this episode is going to be remembered as a memorial for her. And it's interesting that she's not named until later in the first century when John writes about her. We're going to talk about that next week too. This is going to get a little more interesting as we get more specific. They also translated these Jewish Aramaic episodes into Greek. Some of the episodes, I believe, had a Greek context. I believe Jesus was multilingual, and we may talk about that a little bit, but the Jewish Aramaic parts were translated into Greek. And then these episode segments formed the foundation, the skeletal outline, if you will, of early preaching about Jesus, and were later combined in the synoptic gospels into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then ultimately John adds some details later on in the first century in the Gospel of John. And so you have slightly different perspectives that reflect eyewitness differences and editorial differences, arrangements that differ. But in light of that scenario that I think is not only plausible but likely, Matthew, according to Papias, compiled the sayings of Jesus in the Hebrew language. Does that refer to the finished copy of the Gospel of Matthew? Or does it refer to the main section of Matthew is 5 groups of sayings of Jesus? And I'm going to throw out an idea that I want you to chew on. Instead of speaking of the finished copy of Matthew's gospel, could Papias have been referring to the process? In other words, making the tax collector in the crowd, the one whose very professional life revolved around recording and chronicling things. Could it be that Matthew was the stenographer, the record keeper in the group, writing these things down from the very beginning? And then you have a library of information from the get-go. And then the disciples put their memories together of other details, and eventually the Gospels come into play. But I want to reflect particularly on the Gospel of Mark for a few minutes this morning and look at external and internal evidence side by side. We've already looked at Papias. He says that Mark accurately preserved Peter's preaching vignettes of things said and done by the Lord. That is seconded by Clement of Alexandria, who around 180 in the second century says when Peter was publicly preaching the word in Rome and in the might of the Spirit proclaiming the gospel, his hearers entreated Mark, who had for some time accompanied him, and who remembered all that Peter had said, to write down the things related by him. And then when he had written the gospel, to send it to those who had asked him for it, which request, when Peter heard of it, he neither opposed nor supported. Interesting statement, because Clement of Alexandria was born around 8150, and this verifies what Papias had said of this Peter-Mark connection. And also he adds this little tidbit that this was done when Peter was in Rome, which would be the very end of Peter's life in Rome. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. But there's a third statement. Again, Justin Martyr, who in his dialogue with Trypho around the middle of the 2nd century, 150 AD, said, and when it was said that he changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter, and when it was written in the memoirs of him that this so happened, as well as that he changed the names of the other 2 brothers, sons of Zebedee, to Boanerges, that, according to Justin Martyr, was done in the memoirs of Peter. But the only gospel that talks about that is the Gospel of Mark. In Mark 3, 16 and 17, we have that incident. And so I would suggest we have 3 independent records that associate Mark with Peter. We have a bunch of others, actually. But those 3 critically important, because you're looking at 2nd century evidence. And then, of course, from the very earliest times, this gospel is called the Gospel of Mark, which again is interesting because Mark is not one of those prominent characters in the New Testament. If this were pseudepigraphal, if it were, it would have been called the Gospel of Peter. It's called the Gospel of Mark. Why is that? Because I really believe Mark wrote it down, even though it reflects memories that he got from Peter. You have these 3 independent pieces of evidence that Mark's gospel is essentially the vignettes of Peter's preaching about what Jesus said and did. But then you open up Mark and you compare this external evidence with the internal. And what do you see when you begin actually opening up the book of Mark? You have clues that there is a Roman focus. Just as Clement of Alexandria said, this was done in connection with Peter's preaching at the end of his life in Rome. You have a marked preference for words of Latin origin in Mark, unlike the other 3 Gospels. You have constant action, which the Romans would have appreciated. If they were into movies in our day and age, they would have loved fast, action-paced movies. And immediately is a key word. Immediately Jesus does this. Immediately he does that. Immediately he does that. It's constant, fast-paced action in the Gospel of Mark. There are explanations of local Jewish customs. You have in Matthew or Mark chapter 7, for example, that verse 3, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and so on. That detail is just in Mark. It's not in Matthew. Matthew didn't need to do that. He's writing to a Jewish audience. Mark did. He's writing to a Roman audience. You have this little tidbit. The one who carried Jesus' cross, who was compelled to carry Jesus' cross, was Simon of Cyrene, who was the father of Alexander and Rufus, Mark 15, verse 21. And then you have this little interesting, tantalizing tidbit found at the end of Romans chapter 16, when Paul gives his personal greetings to the saints in Rome. He says in verse 13, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, also his mother, who has been a mother to me as well." Paul had never been to Rome, but the mother of Rufus had been a mother to Paul. And if this is the same Rufus, and it probably is, Simon of Cyrene, follower of Alexander and Rufus, you have that little detail in Mark's account for the Roman audience. Here's a connection of somebody that you know. You have other internal clues about key eyewitnesses. And this is where this really gets fun. Jesus was in the boat. He was asleep on a pillow. You catch that? He was asleep on a pillow. The vivid detail. Throwing off a cloak and jumping up, you have this blind man. No leisure to eat. Mobbed by people. Feeding of the 5,000. No leisure even to eat. Looking up to heaven and saying, in a synagogue where you have this mindless traditionalism, Jesus looking around with anger and with sorrow. To the rich young ruler, he looks at him and he loves him. And he proceeds to tell him what he needs to hear, not what he wants to hear. Amazement and fear. We were all filled with great fear, chapter 4, verse 41. You have Aramaic expressions that are remembered. Little touches, exclusively in Mark. Talitha Kumi, child, arise. Ephrathah, be opened. Chapter 14, verse 36. Jesus bows in the Garden of Gethsemane. And mind you, there were only 3 witnesses to that. Abba, Father. It's almost as if an eyewitness is remembering the actual voice of Jesus in his native language. I believe that's exactly what's happening. And you have these vivid scenes. Chapter 27, chapter 1, verse 27, they were all amazed. So they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this?" You have a lot of that in the Gospel of Mark. Constant astonishment. Verse 33, the whole city was gathered together at the door. You know whose house that was? Peter and Andrew's house. Detail, very vivid detail. You have in chapter 1, verse 45, but he went out and began to talk, he went out and began to talk freely about it, to spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in the desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. Over and over and over again, you have statements made to the effect that we were just stunned. We were filled with astonishment. You have gut reactions. You have Peter's impulsive mouth, as you do in the other Gospels, but you have the gut reactions in connection with his impulsive mouth. especially in the Gospel of Mark. You have at the Transfiguration in Mark chapter 9 that Peter opens his mouth and inserts his foot and says, we need to make 3 tents for you, 3 tents, one for Elijah, one for Moses, one for you. And the statement is made in verse 6, for he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Peter and his 2 companions, James and John. And then you have the statement at the very beginning, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. This goes all the way back to an early remembrance, I would say, an apostle, but someone else that he got this from. You also have internal clues about the key eyewitness. You have this crushing personal blow that we talked about in class this morning, but in Mark's account of it, in Mark chapter 8, verse 31, you have Jesus beginning to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests, the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he told the matter plainly. This is the first time that he spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside, began to rebuke him, but turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Seeing his disciples, plural, he rebuked Peter and said to him, "Mind me, Satan, for you're not minding the things of God, but on the things of man." That had to be painful for Peter. And no doubt he would have remembered that rebuke for the rest of his life. It was a crushing blow. You have in ancient historiography, ancient biographies or histories in which one eyewitness is the key eyewitness. Oftentimes in historical accounts of that day and age, the main eyewitness would make a grand entrance at the beginning of the book and make a grand exit at the end of the book. And that's exactly what you have with the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus called fishermen to become fishers of men, Simon is the first one mentioned in chapter 1 and verse 16. And he's the last person mentioned in chapter 16, where you have in verse 7 that Peter is involved here. In fact, it's kind of interesting the way it's worded in chapter 16 and verse 7, that go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. Peter was a disciple, was he not? Go tell his disciples and Peter. Peter singled out here. Why is that? I think we have a good reason already to wonder why that is. You have a lot of we, they transitions in the way that the wording comes out. I don't have time to really develop this because I think my time is almost up and I've got a lot more information. But when an eyewitness is speaking, he often says that, we did such and such. And then if a third party represents that, it's they did such and such. The eyewitness would speak of our, and whereas the third party would speak of their. The eyewitness would say us, and the third party would say them. And you have so many instances of that where that transfer from the first person plural to the third person takes place in ways that are awkward in Greek and sometimes awkward even in the English translation. Don't have time to really delve into that at length, but in the accounts of the apostles, the naming of the apostles in chapter 3, you see it in chapter 1 when Jesus calls Peter, Andrew, James, and John from the fishing boats, and then they go into a synagogue on the Sabbath day in Capernaum, and then they come out, verse 29. You're still dealing with Jesus, Peter, Andrew. Verse 29 of chapter 1. Immediately he left the synagogue, entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Why not just say they? It's been a they, Jesus, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, up to that point, 2 previous episodes. Why not just say they did? They entered this house. And the way it reads is they entered the house of Peter and Andrew, or Simon and Andrew with James and John. As if this were originally reported by Peter. After the synagogue service, we entered into our house. Oh, and James and John. But that is somewhat awkward the way it's worded in the third person as opposed to the first person. And you have multiple instances of that in the Gospel of Mark. And then you have instances like the rooster crow. In Mark, it's 2 rooster crows. It's not just one cock-a-doodle-doo. And then Peter has denied the Lord 3 times. It's 2. The rooster crows, and then Peter denies the Lord 2 more times. And after the 3rd denial, you have a second cock-a-doodle-doo. Who would have been in the best position to give that extra detail that you don't see in the other Gospels? Who would that event have impacted the most? Who would be the most haunted by that for the rest of his life? Peter would have. That little detail is found in Mark's account. You have a little personal signature, I think. At least that's the time-honored view of this statement in Mark 14, 51, and 52, that there was a young man who followed along as Jesus was arrested, and you have all these events of that evening. Nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. We don't know who that was, but the time-honored view over the centuries is that was Mark. Young man, Mark. And interestingly enough, years later, at least a few years later, when James, the son of Zebedee, is executed by Herod Agrippa, and Peter is arrested and about to be executed, the angel releases him from prison in the middle of the night, and he goes into Jerusalem where you have disciples meeting in kind of an underground movement. Kind of reminds me of this, right? Having to meet outside of our normal procedure. And he goes to a house. Remember which house he goes to? He goes to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark. Peter had a long history with Mark's family. They were gathered together and were praying. And then toward the end of his life, in 1 Peter chapter 5, he gives us this tantalizing clue. She who is at Babylon, which, by the way, is a code name for Rome in the early church. You see that in the book of Revelation. She who is at Babylon, probably Rome, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. Again, you have a Peter, John, Mark connection toward the end of Peter's life as he's preaching in Rome. Exactly as Clement of Alexandria said, that this was the background to all of this. And then as Peter was about to lay down the torch and end this life, he says in 2 Peter 1, 12 through 15, therefore I intend always to remind you of these qualities, though you know them and are established in the truth you have. I think it is right, as long as I'm in this body, stir you up by way of reminder, since I know that the putting off of my body will be soon, as our Lord Jesus Christ made clear to me, and I will make every effort so that after my departure, you may be able at any time to recall these things. And so he writes 2 Peter with that in mind, that he's going to be gone very soon, but they'll have 2 Peter. They'd also have the Gospel of Mark, probably written around the same time. There's this great event that occurred in AD 64. We've had a lot of fires in and around California. But imagine having a fire here that destroys about 2/3 of the Santa Clara Valley. That would be devastating, wouldn't it? Devastating enough as it is. But imagine it reaching our own neighborhoods. In July 18th, 64, fire broke out in the city's Merchant area, fanned by summer winds. It continued for 6 days, 7 nights. 70% of Rome was destroyed. And you know who everybody blamed? They blamed Nero, the emperor. And so he tried to deflect the criticism by finding a scapegoat. And you know who the scapegoat was? It was Christians. Tacitus, who was born in the 1st century, in the early 2nd century tells the story from the Roman point of view. he was not a friendly witness to Christians. In fact, he calls Christianity a superstition. But this is what he says. But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. In other words, Nero's order. That Nero did this on purpose. It's a conspiracy theory, maybe. But Nero was blamed. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made by all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination. When daylight had expired, Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus that, while he mingled with people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft in a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty, that they were being destroyed. Christians were killed in droves. The aftermath of the fire of Rome, AD 64, probably into AD 65. I'm going to throw this in for free for those of you who've been in our Wednesday night Hebrews class. Two possible locations of the original recipients of Hebrews. One is Italy, the other is Jerusalem and Judea. And I want to remind you of two statements found in the book of Hebrews. Those from Italy send you greetings. This being just after, a year or two after, all of these Christians die in Rome. Those from Italy send you greetings. And by the way, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted the point of shedding of blood. A lot of people object to that because, well, what about Stephen? What about James the Apostle? What about James, the brother of the Lord, who in the early 60s died? Okay, well, you have Stephen and James the Apostle, who died, 20, 25 years earlier. And you have James, the brother of the Lord, who died in the early 60s, and now you have, 66, 67, whenever Hebrews was written. You have not yet resisted the point of shedding your blood. I think he could say that when he's writing from Italy, where Christians have died in droves. You in Palestine are compromising with Jewish society around you. You need to take a stand. Eusebius, the 4th century Jewish historian, or his history, all kinds of earlier references, some of which still exist, some of which have been lost. So it happened that this man Nero, the first to be announced publicly as a fighter against God, was led on to the slaughter of the apostles. It is related that in his reign, Paul was beheaded in Rome itself, and that Peter was also crucified, and the cemeteries there still called by the names of Peter and Paul confirm the record. In fact, the picture in the background of this slide is the crypt underneath St. Peter's Basilica that is still believed by many, including some archaeologists, to be the very site where Peter was originally buried. Won't get into that, but he died in Rome. Probable date of Mark, AD 64, shortly thereafter. when all this plays out. You have a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem in apocalyptic language side by side with the end of the world, a much later event, with a warning to the reader. Let the reader understand. This hasn't happened yet. Long after it had happened, you wouldn't put the destruction of Jerusalem side by side with the end of the world. It had already happened. In fact, the Gospel of John, written later in the first century, doesn't even mention the destruction of Jerusalem. It had already occurred. But I would suggest to you it had not occurred yet when Matthew and Mark were written. Probably not when Luke was written either. So you have the word of the living surviving voice, just as Papias had said, who left his legacy before paying the ultimate price of martyrdom. He was amazed by Jesus. But I want to end on this note. And we studied it this morning. It's perfect timing. Matthew 17, Luke 9, Mark 9, they all tell about the transfiguration, but I have color-coded the little details, basically the same, but there are little details in each that are different. And I've color-coded the ones that are different in Mark. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, led them to a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. There appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus, and Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi. Matthew's account, it's Lord. In Luke's account, it's Master. But in Mark's account, it's the Jewish Aramaic word, Rabbi. It is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Talk about touches of an eyewitness, personal memories, those little personal touches. Cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud. This is my beloved son. Listen to him. And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them. This is an eyewitness report, ladies and gentlemen. They no longer saw anyone with him, but Jesus only. As they were coming down from the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. That would have been torture to a big mouth like Peter, I think. They have to keep quiet about that until Jesus was raised from the dead. Not to be able to talk to anybody about it, except maybe, Andrew and James. They couldn't tell any of the others. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what in the world is rising from the dead. This touches. Transfiguration is potentially the most sensational event reported in the personal ministry of Jesus. It's either product of an overheated imagination, bold-faced lies, or exaggeration, or words of sober truth. I'm going to end on this note. Parallel account in 2 Peter 1:16. After Peter says, I'm making every effort to get this down in writing so that after my departure you may recall these things. For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We have every reason for confidence when we open Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But we're not only reading history, we're reading history that is full of eyewitness accounts. And we have every reason to put our faith in the central figure of those eyewitness accounts. We're going to sing a song of invitation right now. Go forward.